I'm going to show you how to paint the Gloomtide Shipwreck for Idoneth Deepkin, Age of Sigmar, all the names, and we're starting right now. What's going on, guys? Jared here from MiniJunkie. Welcome to another video. If you watched my last video, guys, on the 5 questions you should ask yourself before you start a painting project, you would know that I've started to work on Idoneth Deepkin. I wish they just had an easier name to say quickly and easily, as my next force. I think I've narrowed down the color scheme I'm going to go for and the basing that I'm going to use, so I'll be starting up painting tutorials on those guys really soon. In the meantime, though, I decided to work on the Gloomtide Shipwreck because it's really a piece of terrain that, you know, it's got its own color scheme. It's easy enough to do. I will say that with terrain, I do tend to cut corners, I tend to go a little faster, and I'm just not going for the same standard that I am for when I'm painting an army or a display model by any stretch. So you'll probably find that this is a pretty easy technique to replicate, and there are a few techniques to replicate. I'll post the paints I use in the comments below, so you can pick them up if you want. I'll give you some alternatives if you can't find these. So last thing I'd mention is that this is a really cool terrain piece, even if you're not playing Age of Sigmar. If you're just playing fantasy games, whether it be Frostgrave or even War Machine with some of their pirate factions, this is just an awesome ghostly shipwreck piece of terrain. If you enjoyed this video about painting the Gloomtide Shipwreck, God, I gotta say every one of these names very slowly and carefully. Consider subscribing and clicking the bell notification so you don't miss any of my videos, because I got a whole bunch of good ones coming up, especially when it comes to the Idoneth Deepkin, but also all other topics, other painting related and hobby topics. So consider subscribing, sharing, liking, all the usual stuff, but let's get into the video.
Okay guys, so here's a look at the finished shipwreck that we're going for, and it's so large it barely fits on my photo background. So I primed mine white, but you could also use GW spray Zhandri Dust, because in hindsight, the color I end up using as the first base coat and that I airbrush on looks an awful lot like Zhandri Dust. Next thing I do is I take scale 75 Caribbean blue and airbrush it. I did thin it a little bit to airbrush it, and what I do is I apply it a lot in like the creases and the joints between sections, and then like the recessed areas to give it that sort of internal glow look. And you could also brush this on, maybe thin it down a little bit so it's more like a bit of a glaze or a wash, but you'll see here where I'm kind of applying it not all over, but more in just a mottled kind of patchy way. And here I'm just looking at the 2 sections. I wanted to show you guys, give you a way of seeing what I meant by not covering the entire surface and just applying it in some of the areas where you might see that sort of ethereal glow coming from. To create a bit of tonal variety, I also do the similar thing with Elysian green, and which I have created an airbrush mix for. You could also use like one of the older, like I think it's Ogren Camo or camouflage green, something like that, a very sort of yellowy green. And again, the reason this looks so sort of patchy and irregular is that's intentional. I want it to look organic. I want it to look like, mossy and just like it's happened naturally. For the base area, like the rocky sandy thing it sits on, I use dark sea green. I'm airbrushing it purely out of speed and laziness. You could absolutely brush this on. Make sure you get the sections that are sort of in between the base sort of boards of the boat. And next is a pretty heavy dry brush of Ironrach Skin. This is the new paint that came out with the Deepkin. It's debatable because it actually is so subtle and so, I guess it kind of matches the base tone quite a lot. So, but what it's doing is it's pulling together all that sort of splotchy blues and greens that we did in the beginning. But here's where you're really going to start to see the detail come out. I'm using GW Pallid Flesh. Same thing, a very heavy dry brush. Work against edges, work against the grains so that the paint will pull those out. So don't dry brush along a board, dry brush across a board. That hopefully you get what I mean. And again, just a pretty heavy dry brush of the entire surface, everything. And the idea is to leave some of those greens and, magical turquoise bluish colors coming through on a lot of the creases and recessed spots, so that you create that sort of inner ghostly glow to it and don't completely obscure them. But that's why we went kind of heavy with those things in the beginning. It's because I knew that when I got to the dry brush step, those were going to get sort of diminished quite a bit by the dry brushing, so that's why I applied it fairly liberally and pretty heavily. Now, I didn't glue any of the fish shoals onto it, but there are some fish modeled right into the sides of the boat and things like that. So what I'm going to do is I want to paint those white and create a base for, I want to paint them quickly because I'm lazy and they're not that interesting to me. So I'm going to be using like a wash and glaze technique on the fish. While that's drying, I grabbed 2 game inks for Vallejo. You got sepia and skin wash. Now, and what I'm doing is I'm sort of blobbing over top of those barnacles. So I'm not trying to like carefully paint each one. I'm sort of using the belly of my brush and a somewhat rounded tip to just sort of blot around the entire surface of the barnacle. Now, what I did find right away is the sepia is quite dark and probably too dark for this. So I did a few more sort of sporadically around the ship just to add a little bit of variety, but mostly I'm using the skin wash, or you could also use brown ink because it creates an orangey brown, which I think looks quite nice and is very distinct contrast against the light ship. Now for the fish, I'm going to use a yellow ink glaze. Yellow ink is quite strong, so it'll create a translucent, very bright yellow effect over the white that we applied originally. And this is a basis which I'm going to use to create some more sort of tropical colors, whether that be green, really bright greens or oranges, because, they're tropical fish, one would assume, so you don't want them to just look sort of silvery and bland. But I'm not also going to sit here and sort of try to paint Finding Nemo on every single one. Continuing with my theme of being lazy, for the ropes around the mast, I just took a little bit of that brown ink, I think it's brown, and I mix it into the yellow that was left over, so as, we don't waste it, just a little bit. So I'm going to create a brownish yellow color, which, a lot of the time rope on something like this would be brownish yellow. So what this does is sort of 2 things. It colors the rope and it creates a bit of shade. I end up doing 2 coats of this, by the way, to make it work. To create an orange effect on the fish, I'm actually going to go over the yellow with red ink. Now, again, lots of different ways you could do these fish. Start with white. You could glaze them with fugue orange shade. You could use bloodletter. There's lots of different ways you could do it. So don't stress too much about trying to find these particular inks just for these fish. The goal is, start with them white so that they'll have some pop to them, some visual brightness, and then just apply some colors and make them look, tropical. You may need 2 coats of this to make it the right shade of orange. So I would say let it dry after the first one and go back and give it another one if you think it's necessary. Next, I'm going to do a glaze of blue ink over some of the other fish that are still yellow. And as you can see, it's pretty cool. It gives it a really nice sort of green, bluish green, turquoisey, not really sure what to call that. I think it's green effect on these fish rather than blue, because they were based in like a yellow. And it's still fairly translucent. And so you get a nice bright color coming through to help the fish detail sort of stand out. And you can spend as much time, this is just how I painted them. But again, when you watch these tutorials, always apply your own thinking to them. If you want to spend more time on the fish, spend more time on the fish. Absolutely. For the bell and some of the pottery, or, I guess I'm going to think of them as copper pots, I used scale 75 old copper, but any copper will do. If you've got, I think it's called Eugenite copper or something like that from GW, or any brand. Oh wow, that's one of my models taking a dive in the background. Just go ahead and use it. But I use scale 75. I'm really liking their metallics right now. They're just a little harder to get a hold of. I want the coppers to actually end up being very corroded from years of being underwater, so I just really slather on the Nihlak Oxide. Apply it as much or as little as you like. This is again a very optional sort of step, but in the end I think you'll dig the result it's going to get. Next step is super straightforward. I'm using Runefang steel. You can use, literally any silvery metallic color you like. Stormhost silver, whatever, anything like that is fine, any brand. I'm just painting the metal bands around the mast and the little rings that are on it, and that's really it. Very simple. Now I'm just going to go down with my brush and clean up any of the dark sea green of the base sort of pedestals where I've gotten all these different colors, whether it's the base tones of the wood and things like that. It's a little hard to allow you to see some of these steps because of the shape of these models, so hopefully you can make out what I'm doing. Now some Aggrax Earthshade that I'm going to apply over the silver metals. I often talk about using a gloss version of these on metals because I don't like how much it dulls them down. But in this case, it's very much intentional to dull them down. They're underwater, they're old. I don't want them to look shiny and new, so I'm purposely using one that I know will take some of that shine off. And again, because it's terrain, I'm not being super meticulous, and I'm honestly not going back and re-highlighting everything because I will usually only reserve that much of attention to my troops, my characters, my army itself. Terrain, not so much. Now I'm going to corrode the metals, including the copper we painted before with the Nihlak. I struggled a bit with when to apply this. I wasn't sure if I should maybe put it on before putting the Nihlak Oxide, but I think this ended up being the right sort of order of operation that I'm happy with. Notice also that I typically don't just paint it on. It kind of depends what I'm working with. If it's tank tracks, I will, because I want to cover the whole surface evenly. In this case, I want the corrosion to be pretty blotchy and irregular and natural looking, so I'm stippling it on, much like I do the stippling of the blood effect in my video about how to paint blood and gore. And in the end, you get a really nice effect where there's a combination of corrosion and the patina of the copper showing through. At this point, I decided that those carved pillars on either side didn't have enough contrast to them, especially like the actual cylindrical, carved sections. So what I did is I just took some Nihlak, painted it over the cylinder part, and then wiped it off a bit with my finger on the upper sort of, what do you call it? The closest side of it, so that it created a bit of a highlight / shade just easily, rather than just have them turn very Nihlak colored, for lack of a better way of putting it, which would look weird because the whole ship is not, you want to match the ship. Next, dry brush with Thunderhawk blue, just along the ridges and edges of the bottom, the gray bottom, just to create that. I'm trying to go for like a bluish gray, like the bottom of the ocean. It's going to be subtle and not super apparent, so you can choose a brighter color if you like. Another optional step to continue adding a little bit more contrast, a little bit more definition to some of these areas. I took P3 Turquoise ink, really nice color by the way, if you can get your hands on it, very useful, and just hand painted it into some of these areas. For example, here I'm kind of globbing it into the backs of those comet sculpts, and between some of the panels of wood. You know, this is as much or as little as you want to do it. A lot of the creases, I ended up putting it there. It occurs to me maybe on the rudder there I could have painted those bands as metallic. Feel free to go back and do so if you'd rather have it that way. I'm fine with the way it looks, so I just left it. Here's a quick look after I've gone in and hand painted quite a bit of the turquoise ink in various spots, including creating a little bit of a wash / glaze on the ends of some of the boards. Getting into the part I wasn't super enjoying, which is painting every little detail of all the various junk all over the ships. It took a little bit of time. Tuskgor fur is a really nice terracotta color, so I used that for some of the pottery, especially the broken ones, which it would make sense that those were like clay or something like that. To mix it up though, I did want some of the pots, especially on the base, to be like gold, as if they were like maybe like a treasure. So I used Retributor armor. You can use any gold you like. This is not, you know, you don't have to use exactly this gold. I also painted, there's some little tiny gold pieces in a few spots, so I painted those as well. Any of the bones and skulls, which there aren't actually too many on this, which is surprising for Games Workshop, but base coat was Zhandri Dust. For the manta ray, decided to use Thunderhawk blue. I didn't want him to stand out a lot from the bottom. I kind of wanted him to look more natural, like a dark sea creature, so I just went for Thunderhawk on this one. For the tentacles, I wanted them to look vaguely natural, but kind of gross and slimy, weird, so I gotta get some better adjectives. I ended up using Slaanesh Gray as a base coat, just basically paint that on to all the tentacles. Really hard to show you guys this with the camera, just because of the way these things are sculpted, so hopefully you get the idea. Just cover all the tentacles with this color. Bouncing back and forth while steps are drying, I decided to highlight the manta with Russ Gray. For the tentacles, which are now dry, just a quick glaze, right from the pot with Carroburg Crimson. This will just give them some modeling, some shading, and a bit of a reddish, sort of sickly flesh color. And I made sure to put a little blob of it in each of the little suction mouths that are on the end of each tentacle. Now some Aggrax Earthshade over most of the details on the base here, like the pottery and even a little bit on the gold, just to tone it down a bit. Now I want to stress that really the bulk of the visual impact of this thing is the wood, the body of the ship, etc. All of the details on the inside area, on the base of the inner base, like all the pottery and things, that's pretty, well, it's up to you how much time you spend on it, you know what I mean? I didn't go too crazy because I was satisfied. I didn't spend a lot of time highlighting it. This isn't a display piece. This would be just something for gaming. So I put the amount of effort in that felt good to me as far as this being a nice looking piece for terrain. Now at this point I was like, wow, I don't really feel like painting a whole bunch of clams that you can barely see on the bottom, but decided to make them stand out a little bit, so I used a fairly bright red, reddish orange. I think this is Wazdaka red. Any bright orangey red would do just fine, and I just basically base coated all of the little clam shell shapes on the base. And once again, lazy and in a hurry to get this thing done. I was getting tired of all those little details. I just Aggrax Earthshade washed the clamshell shape things that I had just base coated red. And again, spend as much time as you like on these. That's totally optional. This is just a baseline guidance on how to do this. Final step is a matte varnish all over, which I do recommend. It'll take the shine off some of the inks we used, and it will protect this as it is a terrain piece. Here's an action shot on my work desk of the final piece. Hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Hope you can find ways to make this shipwreck your own, and we'll see you next time.